This meeting of the Lafayette City Council to order. We are now in open session. Hello. Hello. Hi. We're going to call the meeting to order, and if you would all stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, I would appreciate that. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Okay, in terms of closed session, we will deal with that with an item that's on open session. So there's no announcements from that. That will bring us to public comments. And these would be comments on items that are not on our agenda, but within the purview of the city. We'll start with Mike Griffiths, followed by Val Davidson. Oh, you're seating, I'm sorry. Val is here.
Oh, sorry, this is yours.
Great, thank you.
Hey, welcome back to me. No, it's good to see you guys again.
Oh, okay. Welcome back to you, yes.
I'm here so often. I want to say thanks for your quick action on the safety issue last Wednesday. Thank you for that. That was great, and it was great that the police and others were able to seemingly resolve that, so that was very good. I also appreciate the depth of analysis you did on the car wash. I'm up the hill, but that's not the reason I kind of come here to praise that outcome. I think you did a great analysis, and it was a classic example of a lot of public input, a lot of sensible analysis, and I think the right conclusion was drawn. As you probably know, this is my 6th year of coming up here and speaking at the podium. And so over time, the group that I'm with, Save Lafayette, we've gotten pretty well attuned to the ear of the people. We hear it quite often, whether it's elections or measures or whatever it might be. And so I wanted to talk tonight to something which I know is a consent item. That's why I wanted to talk to in the public session.
So we were going to pull those items off consent calendar. So does it make sense for you to wait for that to actually occur?
No, I don't think so, because to be honest, it being on the consent calendar, you don't have the turnout that you might otherwise expect.
Mayor Anderson, if you are going to pull it, I would encourage that everyone speak at the time for those items, because there may be more.
Well, and that's my concern, is that, you know, that will be the time when everyone will be able to speak.
But my point is that the people who thought it was on a consent item didn't come tonight because they thought it was not on the agenda for speaking. Consequently, all these people who wrote letters tonight and previously wrote letters on this aren't here.
I understand, but we did receive that information, and so that's all part of our record.
But what's the point in allowing them to speak for 3 minutes if you're not going to let them speak?
Well, everyone,
essentially, you've...
Mr. Griffith,
Yeah.
what I'm saying to you is that we're going to pull the items so people can speak on the item. Now, you're saying
but you're supposed
they
to give
didn't
7
come because they thought it was a consent calendar item.
Correct.
They didn't understand the way it works, which is that anyone can pull an item and we can have a conversation about it.
I thought
so
there
we're
was-
going to do that.
I thought-
Now, if you talk about it now,
Yeah.
that's not going to be appropriate, because there's a time to do that when everyone who's interested in the item should speak about it. So
Well,
there's a certain amount of protocol here.
Well, let me, point of order, so to speak, 72 hours notice required on an agenda item. A lot of people aren't here tonight because the agenda that was put out is now being changed right now.
The agenda has not been changed. We have a consent calendar item that we're going to pull, which is the option of the council or anyone in the audience to ask for an item to be pulled.
The people who are not here are the people who would be here had it not been pulled at this last moment after the fact. I don't see that it's defensible.
I have to have you comment on something that is not on our agenda in the public comment portion of our agenda. On our agenda, we have an item which we will be pulling, and you can request that it be pulled as if any other item is under consent. and we pull the item, and people have a chance to speak on it. That's what
What
we're
I was
going to
going to
do.
do was request that this be given a chance for further study on the part of the city that hasn't necessarily done all it could, and the fact that the public could attend, which it wasn't able to do based on the consent
So,
item.
Mr. Griffiths,
Yeah.
if you would simply wait,
I can
we
wait.
can have
I'm
that
not one of
item.
the 40 people who would like to speak.
they're not here. I
They're
can't
correct.
do anything about that, but I can have you speak in turn with everyone else when the item comes up for discussion. That's what I'm asking you to do. Now, can you do that for us?
I can certainly do that.
Thank you.
I'm representative of the people who would like to speak.
Well, that's
So I'd like
fine.
that noted in the record that this is not a proper way to proceed. I do not believe in the sense that you have the right to change the agenda as you wish, but if you want people to have a representation here as opposed to just change it on the fly, then you've done so, and that doesn't encourage them in their regard to this is a public forum.
Well,
because
Mr. Griffiths, let me just reinterpret what I have said for you one more time for the record so you understand.
Sure.
All items on the consent calendar are open to be pulled and discussed. That is something that can come from the council or from the public. We ask that every time we come to consent calendar items. And when it's pulled, it's an opportunity for people to speak. There's nothing different on this agenda than any other agenda that has consent calendar items. It's always the same.
I would just
So you characterize it as being a change, but it's not. This is how we do consent calendar items.
Okay.
Okay? So if you have something to speak on other than what's on the agenda, now would be the time to do it. If not, we'll pull the item and you can speak on it then.
Do you know when it's going to be on the agenda?
I
presume-
don't know. At the rate we're going, we may move it up. I don't know. So
Well, no,
at the rate we're going, we're not going to get there very soon. So I don't know. I don't have a time for you, but
I
we
didn't
will
ask
pull
for
it.
time, but an order.
It's on the agenda for all items that are pulled from the consent calendar. It is
It's item 12, Mayor.
12.
item 12.
Right, 12.
Okay,
Items removed from consent calendar.
good.
Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your patience on this. Okay, so Leonard Doran, followed by David Clark.
I sent you an email earlier about the fires in Lafayette. In the 40 years that I've lived in this area, we drive by Pleasant Hill Road and Highway 24 regularly, and every summer I say to my wife, some jerk's going to throw a cigarette out of the car and those hills are going to go up. Well, it just so happened this year they did. So I wrote you a memo or a request saying that you look into this further, and Joanne sent me a really very prompt, I want to compliment her, very prompt, very full answer about how it works with the fire district. What I'm saying to you is don't trust the fire district. They've set up the fire to pave or to plow relatively little fire breaks. Those hills need to be completely plowed. The city needs also not to rely on those things. You just see it now in Pensacola. You see it everywhere where government operates and big companies do the same thing. One group does their thing, the next group does their thing, and nobody's watching the other guy and make sure it gets done right. I would like the city to set up some sort of mechanism to override and to back up the fire district, but to make sure that they are doing their job as it needs to be done. Otherwise, next summer is going to be a hot summer again, and we're going to be in big trouble here.
Okay, thank you. Any
Point.
questions for the speaker?
Excellent point.
All right, thank you very much. David Clark. Mr. Clark.
Thank you. I'm Dave Clark. I've been participating in a group called Leadership Contra Costa. It's a program that's been around for about 30 years, and it is lasts for 10 months, and every month there's a full-day session on a particular topic that addresses a local issue. The most recent session I attended had to do with business and the economy, and there was a panel discussion about restaurants as part of that day. And what came out of that, I wanted to pass on because it was eye-opening to me. Well, one of the things that one of the 4 participants said was, it was his personal prediction. He's a restaurateur, he has restaurants with hosts and hostesses, waiters and waitresses. His prediction was that within 5 years, he doesn't think there'll be any restaurants with that business model still in business, because the cost of labor is high and getting higher, and it's an unworkable model in his opinion. Now, that doesn't mean restaurants are going to go away. They'll take different forms. And they maybe you order online before you get to a restaurant. Maybe you order in the restaurant. People are still going to sit down and eat. But he's talking about a particular type of restaurant experience not being here in 5 years. And the reason I bring this up is because restaurants are important in Lafayette, both from a revenue point of view and from a downtown vibrancy point of view. So if that's going to happen, I think we ought to be aware of it. Interestingly, another participant was an owner of a food truck company, and they've got a number of food trucks. I was amazed at how positive the response was among all 4 of the participants, one of whom was this restaurateur, one of whom was a food truck operator, and the other 2 have smaller restaurants that do not have waiters and waitresses. But all 4 of them were very enthusiastic about food trucks. In fact, the restaurateur said that he'd be happy if a food truck was parked in his parking lot in front of the restaurant because it brings people. And a concentration of food trucks was also viewed positively. So, again, the reason I'm pointing this out is if at some point in the future we start to get applications for food trucks, I don't think it should be a knee-jerk, no, we don't want those here, because that may be, in fact, the wave of the future as far as restaurants are concerned. One last thing that one of the participants said, which also struck me, was how thin the profit margins are that restaurants operate on. And the man with the waiters, waitresses, hostess, his business model operates on a 2 to 3% margin, profit margin. You take in a lot of money on the gross, but a lot of that, very little of that winds up at the bottom. So they have a public perception problem to the extent that everybody thinks that they're making tons of money, and they're not. His last comment is that his hamburger sells for $16. He said if it were fully priced, it should be $20, but he gets pushback for that. So anyway, I wanted to pass those comments on.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions for the speaker? Vice Mayor Kendall.
Yeah, one question. Do we have food trucks? We've had them here, or do we not have food trucks? Just a question.
We have 1 food truck that parks outside the city offices, but I think on our wish list is perhaps to get a group of food trucks somewhere in the downtown, at least 1 evening a week.
Wow.
Good. Yeah. Okay.
They're all ready to buy already. I mean, here they're lining up. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Clark. Gina Dawson, and it's my last request to speak under public comment.
Hello, City Council members. My name is Gina Dawson. I live on 711 Los Palos Drive. And I'm coming, I guess, to formally ask Council to help us step up whatever action we can to get answer from PG&E about some of the outstanding safety concerns. Some of which are quite, I think, important that we address pretty quickly. There's been an anomaly found in the Spring Hill neighborhood. Information has been conflated with building of a regulator station on Olympic and Relief Station Road in that neighborhood. And we're trying to work out with the CPUC if gas has been, pressure has been reduced as appropriate. So these on top of other outstanding concerns, I think the Gas Safety Task Force, speaking for them and residents, we ask you to perhaps help us construct a letter to PG&E senior executives as well as CPUC senior executives. The lack of information and confirmation that PG&E is operating safely and recording safe operations is critical. This is the same kind of incidents that, the San Bruno incident was something were all totally avoidable if records were kept well and maintenance based on those records was appropriate. So we want to avoid that. We're all about being proactive here as far as the Gas Safety Task Force. So we do request your help in formulating a letter and also inviting PG&E and the CPC back to the Safety Alliance meetings. I think that's critical. Thank you.
Okay, before you head out, I just wanted to make a quick kind of push to the city manager. So if you can get some language, can we get staff to put a letter together that it can go out fairly soon on at least the safety issues that we have that have been brought up by the Gas Safety Task Force?
If that's the council's direction, yes.
Yeah, I think it would be
Yes.
perfectly appropriate.
It's not on the agenda, so I just wanted to comment
I
on
understand.
that.
So I'm asking if staff can actually do that and maybe bring it back and we'll approve it. Okay?
Yes.
And can I add, the Alliance meeting, has anything been, not today, okay, so. Perfect, okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Lynn, needs no laughs name. Good to see you, Lynn, as always.
Lindy Dane, 649 Los Palos Drive. Sorry to do this to you, adding one more person. But I wanted to state that the food truck situation, I hope before we allow food trucks, we will do a far more research than probably we've done to date. Orinda's having big trouble with food trucks. The restaurants are losing business since those food trucks came. And there's a huge controversy going on in Orinda as to questioning why they were ever allowed to come and park in front of and around and so on, the various restaurants there. So I would seriously question. I personally would not be likely to eat in one, or with one, or buy one, but many people probably would. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Would anyone else like to speak under public comment? Okay. With that, we'll move on to presentations, and we have introduction of a new employee.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor Anderson, members of the council. I would like to introduce Nancy Tran. Stand up, Nancy. Nancy is the city's newest senior planner. She has significant current and long-range planning experience, having served as a senior planner in Worcester, Massachusetts. I think I said that right. And most recently for San Francisco. She's worked on a variety of small to large scale projects. She has a lot of expertise in CEQA and inclusionary housing and density bonus implementation. Has worked on, for example, large applications like Park Merced and Treasure Island, Yerba Buena. She grew up in Southern California and got her first planning job in Massachusetts. She says not wanting to deal with below freezing temps and snow 6 months out of the year, she shoveled her way back to California during Snowmageddon 2015. She loves to travel and eat, is always up for trying new food, cooking and baking, and of course sharing that with the city staff. She lives with her husband, I want to know about this. She lives with her husband and his cat, Albert, in Walnut Creek.
Pretty good. All right.
So please join me in welcoming Nancy to the city.
We're very pleased to have you. Welcome. Okay, with that, we'll move on to our report from Townsend Public Affairs. Casey Elliott is here, and we've got a couple of items for support, or our consideration for support. Podium's best.
Good evening. Casey Elliott, Townsend Public Affairs. Wanted to speak to you tonight to provide you a brief update of a legislative wrap-up to give you highlights of what occurred in Sacramento in the most recent session that concluded in September, as well as provide a look ahead as to what we're going to be looking at the second half of the legislative session when the legislature returns in January. Briefly, high-level picture, this year the legislature passed just over 1,040 bills, so 1,042 bills. That's out of 2,600 plus that were introduced this year. Ultimately, the governor signed 870 of those bills and vetoed 172. For historical context, that's slightly higher than Governor Brown's last term in office, but it's generally in line with what we would expect from a governor whose party controls the legislature. That's about historically average. Obviously, there were a lot of those 2,600 bills, a lot of discussion that went through. I think probably the main topic that was of importance to local governments was housing-related measures. We obviously had the city's special meeting to discuss housing bills a couple months back, so I won't go too much into depth on those, but a lot of the bills that we talked about at that meeting at that time were sent to the governor, were pending consideration. Long story short, the majority of them were signed into law. I'll touch on a couple of them briefly. There were a series of 3 ADU bills that were signed into law, AB 68, AB 881, and SB 13. When taken in their entirety, they are going to have a large impact on local government's ADU ordinances, and I would be shocked if work isn't being done to review those measures and look at how they compare with the city's ordinance that's in place for potential revision. Ultimately, those measures went after a number of different areas: size requirements, setbacks, number of ADUs permitted, ministerial approval, assessment of impact fees, parking, short-term rental periods, so very encompassing. I would anticipate that we will probably not see as much dramatic ADU legislation next year, simply to give local governments time to absorb, modify, and implement the new bills. So those were some pretty large measures. Staying within the housing realm, we're already seeing the results from the passage of AB 1482, which was the tenant protection rent cap bills that we saw statewide. While technically that bill does not go into effect until January 1, as I mentioned, we're already starting to see repercussions from that bill being passed. Looking forward, once the bill is implemented, the major provisions, it implements a statewide rent cap of 5% plus cost of living adjustment, not to exceed 8% in any given year. That's applicable to rental units that are over 15 years of age, so not applicable to newer units. What we've been seeing a lot, and I anticipate we'll see some bills in response from the legislature, is that we have been seeing in areas of the state, people are receiving eviction notices so that property owners are able to have new tenants come in and not be held to some of the retroactive rent increases provisions that were in 1482. I think that the proponents and the author of the bill would call that an unintended consequence. I don't necessarily know that was part of a discussion, though there were definitely conversations while the bill was going through that was a possibility. So we are seeing some of those implications. Another major housing bill that was discussed and will continue to be discussed moving forward was the AB 1487, the Bay Area Financing Authority, that was signed into law. That bill creates the ABAG MTC entity, which now has authority to place measures in up to the 9-county Bay Area to increase revenue for affordable housing. The bill itself did not implement any taxes, only authorized, so nothing is in effect until it's been decided on locally. The new authority has the ability to work with counties, cities, stakeholders to come up with a suite of financing options that would then be placed on the ballot in, again, a minimum of 4 counties all the way up to the 9 Bay Area counties. So that's something that I would anticipate locally you'll start hearing a lot of conversations on as those groups consider how they may want to move forward under the new authorities that they have. I'll probably stop there on signed bills. As I mentioned, there was a number of others in the housing realm and other areas. I did want to touch on 2 bills briefly that were vetoed that I think will likely come back in some form or fashion. One was Senate Bill 5, which was one of the housing bills that was broadly supported by local governments, which would have created a state-level funding mechanism to help provide funding for locally approved affordable housing plans. That measure, if it had been signed into law, would have phased into effect over a 7-year period, which would have ultimately made available $2 billion a year statewide for affordable housing. That measure, as I mentioned, was vetoed. In the governor's veto message, he recommended that the legislature consider measures like that as part of the annual budget process. And obviously, when you're talking about up to a $2 billion state general fund expenditure, there's a lot of validity to that. Based on early conversations with Senator Bell, I think that his office at least is going to entertain, if not reintroducing that bill again, at least working through the budget process to see if there is a way that the state can partner with local governments to help provide financing for affordable housing. Another measure that I briefly wanted to mention that was ultimately vetoed by the governor was Senate Bill 531 by Senator Glazer. That measure would have prohibited local agencies from entering into agreements to rebate portions of local tax revenues back to companies. That measure was the result of previous efforts to look at how sales tax was allocated between different jurisdictions, particularly as related to online sales. The measure that Mr. Glazer ultimately authored in SB 531 was a result of the League of Cities and the City Managers Group working together to come up with a proposal. Ultimately, the governor vetoed that measure, which I think surprised many, indicating that he thought that local government should still have tools, economic development tools at their disposal to see fit, to use as they see fit. I think that it's safe to say that we'll continue to see ongoing conversations related to property tax, allocations, distribution formulas. I'll touch on some of those items here going forward in just a little bit. So really, those were some of the big ones that I wanted to highlight now. As I mentioned, there's 1,000 other bills that have varying levels of impact, but those ones are kind of the high-level ones. As we look forward to 2020, the legislature, as I mentioned, will return on January 6th to begin the second year of the two-year session. The most immediate items that they'll be dealing with are the two-year bills that were left over from last year. So as I mentioned, there were about 1,600 bills that were introduced last year that did not make it through the legislative process. Those largely fall into two camps when we talk about procedurally how they will be dealt with in 2020. You have those measures that failed to make it out of their original House, so Senate bills that stayed in the Senate, Assembly bills that stayed in the Assembly. All of those measures, which is the bulk of the 1,600, I would say it's probably 1,400, or not that many, maybe 1,200 of the 1,600 fall into that category. Those bills will be on an accelerated timeline. They will have to have their policy committee hearings, fiscal committee hearings, and be voted out of their House of Origin by January 31st. So it's a 4-week sprint. That would be bills such as SB 50. It's probably the most high profile that falls into that camp. Any bill, any two-year bill that's not out of its House of Origin by the end of January is dead, is no longer eligible for consideration as part of the 2020 year. I put a period there because now I'm going to say asterisk, nothing is dead. The new, for 2020, the bill introduction deadline is later in February. It's around February 21st. So any bill that does not make it out of its House of Origin as a two-year bill can then be reintroduced brand new. So using SB 50 as an example, if it were not to advance out of the Senate, I would anticipate that Senator Wiener would introduce new legislation in February on the same topic. The other bills are bills that have made it out of their first House of Origin, so Assembly bills that made it to the Senate, Senate bills that made it to the Assembly. Those measures are not subject to the January deadlines. They'll just be subject to the normal deadlines that newly introduced legislation is subject to. So bills like that, such as SB 592 would fall into that camp. Those really aren't subject to deadlines until we get further into the legislative session. So those measures, while they're eligible to move, typically wait till May, June, July before they start to see activity. That said, so what are we going to be looking at going forward in 2020? Housing is going to still continue to be a very big topic. As I mentioned, there were numerous housing bills that were signed into law. I think there were almost 200 housing-related bills introduced last year. I would anticipate that we will continue to see more bills for affordable housing. Would not be surprised given the upcoming RENA allocations if we started seeing RENA-related bills. I think that the ADU bills will likely die down a little bit, but streamlining Housing Accountability Act, a lot of the bills that we saw, the themes that we saw this year, I would anticipate we'll see again next year. Obviously, we'll have had the bills that were signed into law will be taking effect, so there may not be as many in those same areas, but there's going to be a large number of bills. As was just mentioned earlier in public comment, I think that we're going to see a large amount of legislation dealing with wildfires, PG&E, PSPS events. I kind of lump those three together. There's going to be bills on each of those components. There's going to be looking at those together in totality, so that's going to take a lot of different pieces. The legislature has already held a couple of informational hearings during the interim to discuss more of the PG&E side of things, but also they've had a hearing to discuss PSPS events. So I anticipate that we'll see planning bills. I think that the mayor was at the bill announcement by Senator Glazer, by Assemblymember Bauer Cahan, dealing with communications components. I think we're going to just see a lot of these bills dealing with the different issues that came up through those events. We've also seen that Cal OES has put out a grant for $10 million for planning and preparedness, which the city was able to apply for funding for, so we'll see how those turns out. I think we're going to see a lot of demands within the state budget process for additional funding, because while $10 million sounds like a lot for that type of activity, it's not. And my guess is when Cal OES releases the final numbers, we'll probably see that pot of funding subscribed 10 to 1. And that was on a grant that was created and then required to be submitted less than a month later. So I mean, there's a demand there, and so I think we'll continue to see that. Obviously, with the court proceedings with PG&E, the governor's involvement, there's just going to be a lot of moving pieces on some complex legislation. We've seen some mayor of San Jose, other mayors already talking about other possible structures that they would like to see PG&E turn into. How that's going to interact with bankruptcy court and those items, I think, is yet to be determined. But obviously, it'll be a very hot topic that'll be discussed all year long, and I would anticipate we'll see significant pieces of legislation that'll probably ultimately boil down to a handful of bills by the end of the year. Speaking of the budget, we've started to see some of the initial budget projections be submitted to the Legislative Analyst's Office. The governor's required to submit his January budget to the legislature by January 10th. At that point, he will put out his priorities for what he would like to see in the January budget, in the FY 2021 budget. The legislature will have a series of hearings over the following 6 months prior to the ultimate adoption of the budget on June 15th. At this point, that Legislative Analyst's Office, they're anticipating a $7 billion budget surplus. It's the easy way to say it. It's a larger budget surplus, but a lot of it gets dedicated towards the state's rainy day fund, goes into programmatic education funding, those types of things. So with the $7 billion budget surplus, it's likely that the legislature and the governor will have $3 billion or so in what would be considered largely discretionary funding. Governor Newsom, similar to his predecessor, Governor Brown, will likely take an approach of doing one-time investments and not wanting to create a large number of ongoing programs. While the economy continues to grow and continues to be strong, there's definite acknowledgement that we are in unprecedented string of growth. So everyone's planning for the economy to level or dip. And when I say economy, I should say state revenues. At this point, the legislature, if they stay on track, should have developed a rainy day fund that'll be just north of $18 billion. So obviously, if state revenues do level out or decrease, the state's in a much better position to weather some of those downturns than they have previously. That said, I think we can anticipate, looking forward, the governor to continue his focus on housing, on affordable housing, on early childhood education, on disaster preparedness. So a lot of the themes that we saw coming out of him, I would anticipate would be where he's going to try to put some of that those new resources if they come to bear. Obviously, the legislature will have their own priorities of what they want to do, and really that's kind of our 5-month dance of the negotiation is where do things level out. But all in all, good news in that there's going to be added revenues. It's always easier to fight over more money than fight over who's going to be cut out of not having enough money. Looking forward also, we're going to, obviously it's an election year in 2020, and there will be a significant number of ballot measures on the November ballot. I bring that up because with the new system of having voter-approved initiatives only on the November ballot, it's led to a lot more legislative involvement in the initiative process. It's led to a lot of initiative proponents gathering signatures and then working with the legislature to have them pass legislation that can either preempt a ballot initiative or compromise on a ballot initiative. So I think that we're going to see a lot of ballot-related items be considered by the legislature. A couple just to bring up right off that are out there that are being worked on right now. In March, there will be a $15 billion education bond on the statewide ballot. It is Proposition 13, not obviously that Proposition 13, but we have a new Proposition 13. So that will be considered. There are, in addition to $9 billion for K through 12 education, largely for facilities, there is $2 billion each in that bond for UC, CSU, and community colleges. So that bond attempts to provide funding for all of the segments of education and higher education within the state. Looking forward to November, we already have an initiative qualified for Prop 13, the original reform, through split roll. While that has qualified, the proponents are actively out on the streets right now gathering more signatures for a measure that could ultimately replace that. Big picture, the November ballot measure would require more frequent reassessments for commercial and other large property holdings, which would then generate additional revenue through properties being assessed at their current market value as opposed to their historical Prop 13 values. As I mentioned, the proponents are gathering new signatures to modify the way that they treat small businesses within that. That Proposition 13 initiative, the amendment, the split roll on November, will likely lead to a discussion in the state legislature about a broader tax reform. Whether or not the legislature wants to tackle something like that in election year remains to be seen, but having this initiative on the ballot will likely prompt discussions about property tax levels, sales tax levels, sales tax for services, kind of the broad tax code overhaul that oftentimes gets talked about and never gets implemented. I think that we're headed for another one of those years where we have a large discussion looking at the state's total property tax, or excuse me, sales tax, property tax base. So that'll likely be a conversation which could involve dozens of pieces, though in as much as it modifies, potential bills would modify property tax, those ultimately would have to go back to the voters if they do any amendments to Prop 13, Prop 208, or any of those otherwise voter-approved measures. I mentioned earlier, AB 1482 was signed into law. That said, we have an initiative that will be circulated for statewide rent control, similar to the ballot measure that was on in 2018 that was on the ballot. That's being circulated right now, so that may prompt a legislative conversation about furthering modifications of AB 1482 or some of the other associated issues. So I anticipate that rent control will be a large topic. And then also, one that I'll quickly mention is there's 3 different legislative vehicles that are currently in print that would provide for a natural resources bond in 2020. We're using the phrase natural resources bond because really it's an everything bond. It would have water, it would have parks, it would have wildfire. So lots of different items would kind of go into this broad basket. But depending upon how that unfolds, that could, as I mentioned, provide additional funding for a number of local projects to address water, park, wildfire issues. So I anticipate that we'll see legislation on that. Briefly, just by process, anything that the legislature would place on the November ballot would likely need to be done prior to their adjournment for summer recess. So these are really items that we'd be seeing significant activity on in the May, June, July timeframe. And I think maybe with that, I will pause on there before I go into the two specific bills to see if there's any questions.
Any questions?
No, not for me.
Okay, you're doing fine.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Two bills that we have in front of you for consideration for taking positions on. Both are in the public safety wildfire realm. Both are 2-year bills. The first one, AB 281 by Mr. Frazier, is one of the bills that I mentioned that is still in its house of origin. The bill was introduced last year, was double referred to Natural Resources as well as the Utilities Committee. Didn't receive a hearing in either committee, but obviously given the events since that bill's introduction, I think that there's going to be some pressure to consider bills like it. And I think that it may be something that of interest to the city. Essentially, the bill would require the PUC to require electrical corporations to develop and administer programs to replace overhead power lines, both within public right-of-ways and on private property, with underground electric facilities. In the last several years, bills that contain undergrounding have not fared well. It's led to a lot of the problems that we have now, honestly. However, in light of the recent wildfires in PG&E, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the legislature to move forward on legislation like this. So whether it's AB 281 or a new vehicle that gets introduced in February, I think that we're going to see some pressure for the legislature to direct the PUC, to direct the administration, to direct PG&E, SoCal Edison, San Diego Gas to start investing in their infrastructure and doing it in a way that's safe for communities around the state. So before you, we have a draft letter for a support position for AB 281. Again, hopefully would be working with Mr. Frazier to get that bill through committee and through the process. As I said, it has the full way to go, so it's quite possible that it could be introduced as a new legislation in February, but knowing the assembly member, when he gets behind something and gets his eyes set on something, he pursues it aggressively. And then the other measure, which is I apologize for the 111 pages that I put in your packet on the text of that measure, but it is a complicated measure. It's a comprehensive measure, but ultimately, what the bill does is it would modify certain planning responsibilities for local governments to account for fire hazards. It would also require regional housing needs allocation, RHNA planning to reduce the pressure to develop in high severe fire areas, as well as wildlife urban interfaces. And then it also establishes various criteria for what that means, what the planning means, what the risk means, what need to be taken into account for various sizes of developments. There's portions that would require the state to develop some of those items, because a lot of those planning and processes that they would want local governments to be considering are not yet developed. So would have the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, which does a lot of the items related to RHNA, CEQA, working with the state fire marshal's office, with Cal OES to develop some of those criteria. And then it would also create funding available for local governments to adequately plan to incorporate these into planning. As you know, oftentimes the areas that these bills would be impacting are more rural, do not necessarily have the staff capacities to take these on, and so the state's definitely cognizant of that. And in this bill, the way it's written, there would also be some resources to work with local governments to provide that. SB 182, this measure, made it almost the entire way through the legislative process last year. It was put on the Senate inactive file on the last night of session, so it has gone through both houses and is literally just waiting for its last floor vote on the Senate. So that vote can be taken literally at any time once they come back. Like I said, there won't be any necessarily pressure until the end of next session to get it done, but that is something that could be done at any point. And so those are the two measures that we have before you for your consideration. And again, with that, I'll just defer to any questions.
Okay, great. Are there any questions? Councilmember Geringer.
No questions, just actually comments in terms of thank you for the work that you've been doing and the very thorough presentation report to us. And yes, it was a very long bill, but there was a lot of nuance to that. I'm actually ready to, through consensus or through a motion, I guess.
I think a motion would be appropriate.
Yes. So I would move that we authorize the mayor to sign the letters of support for SB 182 and AB 281.
Okay.
I second.
Okay, I have a second. Any comments? Councilmember Bliss?
Yeah, not specifically to the motion, but just want to echo the thanks from Council Member Geringer for the great work by Townsend this year. As chair of the legislation committee, had a great, really enjoyed working with your team over the past year, and I feel like going into next year, in addition to whatever action we take on this motion, I feel like we're well positioned to be responsive on things like SB 50 and other key legislation that could affect our city. So just want to note that, and I'm ready to vote on this motion.
Well, I'll call the question. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? It's unanimous. So those will move forward. Thank you, Casey, for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Would anyone like to speak on this item at all? Oh,
I know, thank you.
when the lobbyist gets applause, you got to worry. Okay, any comments on this presentation? All right, with that, we'll move to council reorganization. And we have a presentation. That's what it says.
Okay, so actual presentation. Okay, so first off, I want to first show my appreciation for Mayor Mike Anderson in accepting that he will be mayor for this next year. I am. He not only stepped in for when Cam went down, when Cam had to pull back, but he's also going to continue on for this next year, and I think that's really great, and I'm very thankful that you're doing that. I also want to say just a couple of comments that, so we in Lafayette, we had a pretty good year, 2019, and then the fall hit, and but what did we do? We really came together as a community, and under the leadership of our emergency preparedness, under our fire, and under our police, we were not only able to handle navigate these PSPSs, but then have an actual fire and actual evacuations, and I want to thank everybody dearly for that. Then moving on into our dedicated police force, and what they have done in the recent month is unbelievable, and we as a community are so thankful to have them here. I can't thank you enough. And then all this under with our Lafayette staff and our wonderful new city manager, Nirup Srivatsa. I sincerely wish you all a very uneventful end of the year because you totally deserve it. Anyways, well, I just want to say thank you, and I look forward to this next year. I have a lot of learning to do before possibly filling in next year for Mike, so I am very thankful that he is going to take this next year.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yes, okay, so was that my presentation as the vice mayor for next year? No, you need to present now too.
One at a time.
Yeah, the vice mayor typically hands the mayor a gift for a job, a token of our appreciation.
Oh,
magic!
What a surprise! Okay, well, we'll pop this open real quick. It's gonna be tough. I have a few comments to make. I'll make it quick, but it's been a very eventful year for us. And I'll kind of restate some of the things Vice Mayor Candell said. Let's see, what does it say? Oh my. It's a $200 gift certificate for the Bridges Golf Club.
Ooh.
That's a couple of rounds. That'd be nice. Okay, I can do that. Wow, what's in the package? Maybe some shorts or something.
Could be. It could be, actually.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. Oh, very nice. Lafayette warmer there.
It says mayor on it.
Golf balls, of course. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Let me quickly make some comments about this last year. It started out, of course, with Mayor Burks giving us 5 objectives to work on, which we have completed 4 out of the 5. The 5th is going to be part of the General Plan Update 2020. So incredible progress there with staff as well as the council trying to pursue those different objectives. As mentioned, then we hired, the council hired Nirup Srivatsa as a new city manager. You don't have to applaud again, so we know that. The city manager then hired the lobbying firm of Townsend Public Affairs. Yes. This was a move, I think, that was kind of it got its start from the whole discussion or worry about the legislative process and what was happening to our ability to do planning. The city manager thought this was the way to move forward and to link with other cities. And I think what we've gained from that is some influence on what's happening in the legislative process. Not much, but some. So with time, we may become more of a player, and it's gonna be very important. Another big item was the acquisition of the Batwing property. This is a major improvement on our open space area for the city. Great assistance from the John Muir Land Trust. And this is one of those big pieces that is going to help us realize our goal for more open space for the citizens of Lafayette. But I think more importantly, remind us that there is open space out there that is available. If we kind of put our minds together, our heads together, we can pick more of that off. It does cost money, but you'd be surprised what we can do. Fire Station 16 reopened. Supervisor Candace Anderson is here. Thank you for all of your work. And so now, once again, we've got good fire and emergency response in the northwestern area of the city. That's been a problem for quite some time, but now we're back in business there. And we got a chance to push the fire truck into the shed there. And I thought they were going to turn it on, but no, we had to actually push it in. But the firefighters are strong. We look good, but they were pushing it. Right? We also had the first public safety power shutoff, and then the second one. And the confusion around that whole program still is with us today. I think one of the things that we're going to talk about, I think, about going forward is trying to get a better handle on what we can and cannot do. And I think Gina Dawson talked about some of the issues. The Gas Safety Task Force has been an incredible resource for the city. And what we do with that information in terms of formalizing it, I think is something we need to think about. Recently, we had the announcement of the Lafayette Police arrest of the home invasion suspects. Chief is here. Well done. And I think I expected it to happen because every report that you give to us is you're solving cases, what, 80%, 85%? So this would have been easy. Well done. Well done. And the city is ending the year with a strong fiscal position, which you'll hear about a little later on, and our reserves are exceeding 60%, which has been our target. So that is a combination of all of us working together to make that happen. So I think it's been a spectacular 2019 with a lot of bumps that we've gone over successfully and more that we have to do in 2020. So those are my comments in regard to 2019. Now, according to the agenda, we now need to have nominations for new mayor and vice mayor. So we're open for mayor nominations.
I would like to nominate Mike Anderson for mayor of the city of Lafayette for the 2019-2020 year.
Okay. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Excellent. I would be happy to serve in that. Are there any other nominations? All right, we'll close that process. We'll call the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
I guess I can vote, so I'll say
Yeah,
yes,
go for it
I'll
for
take
sure,
it.
For sure.
Thank you very much. I'll be happy to serve for another year. We now, thank you. We now need to elect a new vice mayor, and I would be pleased if current Vice Mayor Kendall would continue as vice mayor into the next year.
It'll be my honor.
I'll second that, or would you like a motion?
I think a motion, that was making the motion, but a second
Okay.
would be great.
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? All right, we'll call the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Unanimous again. How's that happen? Okay. So with that, let me move to my goals for 2020. So one of the things we need to do is, and I know staff is working on this, is to kind of review the strategies developed under the objectives that Mayor Burks put us on. And we need to really look at developing a budget and a proposal for implementation of those high priority items. There was an incredible amount of good information that was generated, and I think that we would really miss a great opportunity if we didn't take advantage of that. So hopefully staff can make that a priority. The other item that I have in 2020 is to increase the awareness of the impacts of past legislation on the city planning and development review processes. And if you're here tonight, so you heard some of what Casey Elliott was telling us about in terms of new bills. But there are current bills in place now that people need to recognize that they already are going to begin to change our ability to affect planning and development projects. One such example is SB 330. And SB 330 changes the overall timeline, maximum timeline for consideration of a project from 120 days to 90 days. And in that 90 days, you can have no more than 5 hearings on the project. That's workshops, commission meetings, city council considerations. If it's appealed, it opens it up and you have more. But basically, it's a very limited ability to craft a project or to shape a project, which is something we've done consistently over the years and fairly successfully. That is going to be very difficult to do in 5 meetings. So I know staff is already coming up with some ideas of combining different commissions so that they can get 2 or 3 issues resolved in one meeting, but it's going to require the public to get involved early and recognize there's going to be a very limited opportunity to make comments so that we can accept those and make changes in projects. So that's a new thing. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that we need to find a way, and I know Jeff is here, but we need to find a way to increase the awareness of these new limitations. Because we often hear today that people didn't know something was happening, or they found out much too late, or now we're having the final hearing and they never heard about it. Well, this is even going to be more drastic. So we really need some emphasis on getting the word out and getting people informed about what they can and cannot do. The next item which I'd like us to think about is possibly modifying the Capital Project Advisory Committee to include the evaluation of the operation of public utilities and add 3 members to the 4 that are there now so we have a larger commission. I'm only bringing this up as a possibility to begin to incorporate what's coming from the Gas Safety Task Force in a formal commission or committee process of the city. The Capital Project Advisory Committee right now has a very strong engineering background. They're very public works oriented, and I would hope that this would be something that would fit within their overall lexicon. One of the things that I would hope that they would be able to do is advise us not only what's happening on utilities that we have today, much as the Gas Safety Task Force is giving us a dashboard on our conditions, but also to look into options we may have for the future, such as the concept of microgrids for electrical service as a way to bring down the level of impact from a PSPS event and have microgrids that maybe in certain parts of the city or maybe across the city where we can have separated power sources that will keep the city lit in that particular area. Just an idea. I know it's a long way off, but this is the kind of thing I think would be helpful to have a committee actually looking at, because this is an ongoing problem for us. Obviously, we're going to begin the update of the general plan. I think that's on the agenda, so that's going to be a very important process. Hopefully, it won't take 10 years, but maybe we can get it done in 5. Also, we've been talking about the creation of a density transfer ordinance, and I think that was stimulated by the Park Theater project. However, I think in discussing it with the consultant we have, it also may be a way for us to move around density and put it in areas that could be better mitigated in terms of height, looking at putting higher structures where topographic features may make it appear less high, which is something that happens in certain places in the city, may be something we can do through density transfer. So I think focusing in on that and taking a real hard look at that would be very good. And the last item I have is really reviewing and consider expanding our current video surveillance systems to enhance city security. I know that we have a very strong system, Chief, but I just think it's one of those circumstances where we need to keep on our toes, new technology, look if there's things out there we can do better to get information that you need to make those arrests that are so useful for us and keeping the community safe. So hopefully those are the kinds of things we can look at for 2020. And I have a presentation to the new Vice Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you. Aw. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Susan, for being a great Vice Mayor and continuing in that role. Do you have any comments about 2020?
Just briefly, I will continue to support the mayor and learn from him as much as I possibly can. I'm very thankful for his leadership. Appreciate it. My personal efforts this year, I think, are going to be a big haul because ABAG and MTC are going to go through their Plan Bay Area 2050, and they're going to go through all our new RENA numbers, and I've started prepping us possibly with that information today. So that'll be probably my big haul this year. It's going to be a big one.
That's important.
It is important.
Okay.
Thank you. But thank you, everybody. Thank you for being involved and staying involved and coming to these meetings. You guys are great.
So,
thanks.
I know we have some distinguished guests here who are Candace Anderson, yes, if you would like to come up, and Don Tatson.
Well, good evening, Council. This is one of my favorite times of the year where I get to visit each of the city councils in my district as you reorganize your leadership, and it's a lot of fun for me. It's fun to touch base. You are such a young council. I love looking up here and recognizing that most of you haven't been on the council that long, with the exception of Mike. And Mike joined Lafayette City Council around the time I joined Danville's Town Council. I was appointed in 03, but first ran in 04, and Mike ran in 04 also. And so for me, it's been a wonderful 15 years working with Mike. He and I sit together on our Solid Waste Authority, Recycle Smart. And Mike is just a pleasure to work with. He has such a calm demeanor. Nothing phases him, but he has such keen insight into each and every issues. And I think he is able to communicate that so articulately. So it's always great. I love the partnership that we have with you. Yeah, for me, reopening Fire Station 16 as a director from Confire was something that was on my top of my goals for the last 4 years, and we did it, working together as a community, and in large part it was the leadership in Lafayette. And certainly your contract with the Sheriff's Department for your police services. To me, Danville also contracts with the sheriff, as does Orinda, and when I sat on the council, I realized I wasn't just getting a police force, but I had everyone behind them in the Sheriff's Department, and I think as we've seen, with the quick investigation, the turnaround in these two horrific home invasion robberies in your community. You've got a wonderful police chief, and you've got a lot of great sheriff deputies behind him who are really working hard on your behalf. But I do have a proclamation for Mike. Now, I didn't know you were going to give him a second year around, so I think Mike has this is probably the fourth recognition or proclamation I've given Mike, and so he just sort of is getting this big stack of them. Next year I'll be back. I'm going to have to come up with something bigger and better than this, but I'd love to present this proclamation to you. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it would take too long with all of his great accomplishments, but I'm just delighted that Mike is going to be mayor one more time.
Okay, Don Tatson.
Well, thank you. I'm Don Tatson. I'm here representing State Senator Steve Glazer this evening. And before I also have a proclamation from him and from our Assembly member, Rebecca Bauer-Kahan. But before I do that, I just wanted to congratulate all of you on a successful year, and particularly Mike as a successful year as mayor, and Susan as a successful year as vice mayor. I've served with Mike, or known about Mike's service for a long time. It predates his joining the council in 2004. It goes back to general plan. It goes back to planning commission. And what I've seen is Mike can handle any topic you throw at him, and he does it with a grace and charm that is unusual. And sitting back there this evening, you saw that on display in some of the early items on tonight's agenda, where things that might have gone not as smoothly as they should have did go smoothly. And it's because of Mike's skills and accomplishments. And so I consider it one of my things that I've continually tried to learn from is to watch Mike. Susan, I had your privilege of serving as his vice mayor the other times when he was mayor. And so there, you're right, there's a lot you can learn by watching Mike. So on behalf of the senator, I'm happy to issue a proclamation, and we'll be back next year, assuming you don't repeat for a third year.
I don't think that's possible.
Okay. Oh, anything's possible. But congratulations and thank you.
Okay. All right. So, with all of that, it's time for cake. We're out in the lobby, I assume, and it's a good cake. So let's give it a try. Come on.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
It was a little kind of